Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Davis, and I am the Dean of the Faculty of Science. Welcome to our first virtual homecoming. We're so pleased to be able to provide an alternate program this year as we all continue to live with COVID and the adjustments that entails. Our alumni are so very important to us, and we wanted to ensure we provided the opportunity to gather this homecoming weekend, even virtually. This afternoon, we are pleased to welcome you to Science-Based Talks. Today, we have two very exciting speakers in our hour together. The format of this session will be, we'll have a 20-minute talk, a few minutes for questions, and then another 20-minute talk, and another few minutes for some more questions. During the question period, please type your questions in the Q&A box. You'll see it on the bar at the bottom or top of your screen. And we'll get to as many questions as we can in the time we have. I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the afternoon, Dr. Cami. Professor Cami is in the Department of Physics and Astronomy in our faculty. He's the director of the Hugh Cronin Memorial Observatory, and he's the Associate Director of Research and Outreach for Western's new Institute for Earth and Space Exploration. Dr. Cami will be presenting a talk entitled, "Are We Alone? The Search for Life in the Universe." Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cami.
Thanks, Matt. And let me start sharing my screen here. Okay, so I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to have the opportunity to talk to you. And it's about one of my favorite topics. And so I will gladly entertain you for the next 3 hours on the topic of the search for life in the universe. And so the search for life in the universe entails a few different aspects, but fundamentally it comes down to finding an answer to this perhaps most important scientific question: are we alone? Are we the only beings in the universe, or are there other beings out there that are looking up and wondering whether they are alone? Do they have family? Do they have pets? Do they have social insurance? Should we go looking for them? Are they looking for us? And perhaps have they already found us? And so all these questions are important questions to consider. But right now, of course, we only have a sample size of one. That's life on Earth. And one thing I want to point out is if you look at depictions of aliens, you typically find that certainly intelligent life is very humanoid. That's a bit surprising if you look at life on Earth. And so life on Earth is enormously diverse. A lot of species don't look at all like human beings. And that, of course, is the consequence of billions of years of survival of the fittest and adaptation to extreme environments sometimes. And so all the life that we know of today is even a small fraction of all the life that ever roamed the Earth. And so the search for life in the universe must actually include much more than all the life we can actually consider right now. And so there's been other life forms. How do we know? Well, one of the ways that we know is that's actually in your genes. And I don't mean your trousers, I mean in your genetic makeup. If you compare any two random humans, you find that they will actually have DNA that's similar to the order of 99.5 to 100%. But if you look at how closely related our genes are to other life forms, you actually find that, as you may guess, we are closely related to chimpanzees, for instance. But even with such remote life forms as yeast and plants, we actually do still share a considerable fraction of our genetic material. And so you can actually rank different life forms based on that similarity. You can compare species. And so sometimes in the press, this goes wrong, by the way. A few years ago, we had these twins, Mark and Scott Kelly, where one half of the twins went to space. And when they come back, there were all these news stories about how his DNA had changed by 7%. That, of course, is not quite the case, because you would have to wonder, did he come back as a mouse or something like that? Of course, what is the case was this gene expression, or the level of gene expression, is what changed by 7%. So if you would make a list of all the species that we know on Earth, and you would rank them in order of how similar they are, what you find is, well, all animals are right here. The further you go down on these branches, say the earlier species, you have to consider that had a similar genetic makeup. So we share most of our genetic material with species right here. As you go down, we share less and less genetic material. And so as you come down here at the bottom, you find a species that has a number of genes that all life on Earth has in common. And so human being has about 24,000 genes. 355 of those we share with all these species on this list. And so that leads us to this whole concept of what's known as the latest universal common ancestor, or LUCA for short. And so if you kind of work this into a time frame, you find that that latest universal common ancestor, so essentially the life form from which all current life on the Earth evolved, must have lived about 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago. Now we know what those genes actually tells us. And so one of the things, for instance, that we have figured out is in those 355 genes, there are genes that make us believe that this first life form from which all the life developed was a thermophilic species that could metabolize molecular hydrogen, so H2. So it's something that lived in a warm environment without oxygen necessarily and feeding on hydrogen. Coincidentally, that time scale, about 3.5 billion years, is also about the time scale of the oldest fossils that we found. And so this image is an image of what looks like rocks on a beach in Shark Bay, Australia. It's actually not rocks. These are stromatolites. They're microbial colonies. And in fact, some of the oldest fossils that we know are exactly the same sort of species. They're stromatolites. And so they're about the same age, about 3.5 billion years old. So that's how old life actually already is on Earth. And so if you take everything into consideration, you have early life that formed in warm environments. There's essentially kind of two schools of thought about where life originated. There's these black smokers, these deep sea volcanic vents. If you go looking there, it's teeming with life. But also if you look at these hot pools, this picture here on the right is one of my favorite places. It's the Grand Prismatic Spring in Yellowstone. And all the colors you see there are the consequence of different types of cyanobacteria. And so life probably originated in one of those areas, either hot springs or deep sea volcanic vents. And so those apparently are the conditions that are amenable to developing life. If you look on the time scale of the Earth, so the Earth was formed about 4.5 billion years ago. We're right here on the right. 3.5 billion years ago is about here. And actually there is some evidence that life is older than that. We find evidence in what's written here, Jack Hill's zircon. There's isotopic evidence that life may have existed then already. And so essentially what you see is that once the Earth formed, it didn't take very long for life to actually arose and evolve after that. It took a lot longer for intelligent life to develop. It's really only in the last few thousand years that we could consider intelligent species on Earth, if at least you consider our species to be an intelligent species. And so a lot of people will actually say, like, well, you know, if life arose that shortly after the Earth formed, it cannot have been that hard, really. There is some evidence that perhaps life actually was wiped out several times in the beginning and reformed. And certainly if that's the case, then formation of life cannot have been that hard. And so it poses some more questions. It didn't take long for life to arise on Earth. So if that means that it was easy, then what does it mean for intelligent life? That took a lot longer. So is that then a lot harder to do? If you even consider primitive life like single-celled organisms, they are chemically speaking already extremely complex. And so how can that happen so quickly after the Earth forms when conditions are not particularly great for forming complex molecules? And the most important question, I think, is what about those circumstances? So what circumstances do you need to develop life or intelligent life? Are those circumstances exceptional, like you need a lot of things happening at the same time? If that's the case, then life or intelligent life is just a coincidence, and then the prospects are not great for finding other beings in the universe. But if these circumstances are rather normal, then actually it's unavoidable that there's other life in the universe. And so the bottom line is what we need to know is we need to understand as much as possible about the origin of life on Earth. And the more we know, the better we can actually estimate the odds for extraterrestrial life. So let's look back at one of those questions, which is about that chemical complexity for early life. How is that possible? How can we get complex materials on the Earth assembled so quickly? Well, the answer is surprisingly perhaps in space. So each day there's tons of meteorites that land on Earth, and actually that's a small fraction of the amount of asteroids and meteorites that would actually have hit the Earth billions of years ago. And when these meteorites land on Earth, that's great. You can actually take them to a laboratory and analyze their content. And it turns out that some meteorites, they contain a surprisingly large amount of complex molecules. And so for instance, some carbonaceous chondrites, as they're known, they contain more than 70 different kinds of amino acids. Now, amino acids are a very important molecular species for life on Earth. All life on Earth uses only 20 different kinds of amino acids. And in fact, all those 20 kinds we have found in meteorites. And so that's one way to bring in lots of complex species on the early Earth. And so we think certainly that life was landed in extraterrestrial hand. If there is a large supply of things like amino acids, you don't have to make those amino acids anymore in the early conditions on Earth. And I'll come back to that. Now you may wonder, like, who put those amino acids in these meteorites to begin with? Well, it turns out that it's sometimes easier to make complex molecules in space than it is to make them on the conditions that were on the early Earth. So here an example from 2009, there's like two molecules here, species, I always kind of forget exactly what they are, ethyl formate and N-propyl cyanide. And they were detected in an interstellar cloud close to the center of the Milky Way. Now, these molecules may not say you a lot, but actually these are molecules that you probably have encountered at some point in your life. These are used in the food industry, especially this ethyl formate. It's used in the food industry, and the authors of this paper, they knew that very well. So in all their press releases, they essentially had this title: "The center of the Milky Way tastes of raspberries and smells of rum," because that is specifically what this molecule is being used for. And so it's not that aliens are brewing this in a bar near the center of the Milky Way. It's essentially that the conditions in those interstellar clouds are such that it's a lot easier to form those complex molecules there than it would be on the early Earth. And coming back to these amino acids, there's some more puzzling things about the amino acids. So amino acids have this generic form depicted here. R can be different for all amino acids, but all the amino acids have this NH2 group, that's an amine group, and a carboxyl group. But essentially, almost all amino acids have two different forms, and they have a left-handed form and a right-handed form. And so chemically, they're the same, but they're like each other's mirror images. And all life on Earth essentially is all using the left-handed versions of the amino acids. It's a bit surprising because if you make amino acids with chemical experiments, you make about 50% of the left-handed version and about 50% of the right-handed version. So why would all life on Earth use only the left-handed version? Well, it turns out that once you have a system that uses amino acids, if you have a slight preponderance of one version, that will actually fairly quickly dominate. So the question is, how can we get now a preponderance of these left-handed species? Well, let's go back to the meteorites. And here's an example of a Tagish Lake meteorite, carbonaceous chondrite as well. Those contain these amino acids. Where do those amino acids come from? Well, some of my colleagues from the NASA Ames Research Center, where I worked before moving to Western, they had this idea that you would make these amino acids in interstellar ices. So in interstellar clouds, there's lots of dust grains that have ice mantles. And those ice mantles are fairly simple. They typically contain water, ammonia, and some CO2, for instance, and maybe small amounts of formic acid, for instance. But there is UV radiation. And so if you have these ices and you radiate them with UV light, what comes out? Lo and behold, you find these amino acids. So this simulation where you take the ices, you radiate them with UV light, amino acids come out. But there's actually more. It turns out that UV radiation in the interstellar medium is as it said, circularly polarized, and that has to do with how that light has passed through dust clouds. If you repeat this experiment, and you repeat the experiment with circularly polarized UV light, what you find is that for almost all the amino acids, you find a preponderance of the left-handed version. And so it starts forming a nice story. You have natural processes that form these amino acids, that form a preponderance of left-handed amino acids. If you collect those in meteorites and you see them on the Earth, then that's one way that you can kickstart life on Earth. There's kind of another interesting part to this. When these researchers essentially cleaned out their experiment, their ice experiment, they looked at it under a microscope, and it looked like this. And so these structures here, they look a little bit like cells. And in fact, what they are, they represent the formation of membranes. And so these membranes are not like the bilipid layers that life on Earth is using. These membranes are actually made of sequences of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs. And that is in itself interesting, because that again is one of those building blocks, and that could be very interesting. If you can make these cell membranes, you can actually create small pockets where you can change the chemistry compared to what's possible on the outside. And those PAHs are widespread and abundant. I'll show you an example, because I think this actually gives some indication as to how widespread life could be. So this is an image, a Hubble Space Telescope image of the Whirlpool galaxy M51. So this is a galaxy that contains of the order of 200-300 billion stars. I'm now going to overlay an image taken in the infrared by the Spitzer Space Telescope. And anything that looks a little bit red indicates a high abundance of these PAHs, so of these residues from these ice experiments. There you go. You see them everywhere. These things, these possible building blocks for complex molecules, are very widespread and abundant in space. And so essentially what we think, how did life on Earth arose? Well, it's essentially chemistry. You have the right ingredients, you have the right conditions, and then reactions will occur, and these reactions will lead to life eventually. And of course, exactly how, we don't know. But we say chemistry is like cooking, just don't lick the spoon. And so essentially all you need if you want to search for life in the universe is figure out what those necessities are. And so one of the key ingredients that we think is important is actually liquid water, or possibly another solvent. That's because, again, it's chemistry. If you have a solvent, you make chemistry a lot more plausible. And so that's why people were actually searching for so long for water on Mars, which we have found now in a variety of ways. And actually, as recently as 2 weeks ago, there was this news item about buried lakes of liquid water. And so there's places in our solar system that are good candidates for finding evidence for life. Mars is one of them. Europa is another one. Titan, the largest moon of Saturn, is another one. And Catherine Niche will talk a little bit more about it afterwards. But what about the rest of the universe? How do you find life around other planets? Well, it's essentially 2 steps. First, you find the planets. Then you find those planets that can have liquid water on their surface. Those are called planets in the habitable zone. And then you can go and find life on those planets. But that already is quite challenging. And the first part we know how to do. That's how to find planets. Well, we have a very simple technique where essentially if you look at a star that has a planet moving around, as the planet moves in front of that star, the brightness of that star temporarily goes down, because essentially the planet blocks part of the light of the star. So if you observe a star and you see these periodic dips in brightness, that's a good indication that there's a planet going around. The only problem is that you really need to have your planetary orbit well aligned so that the planet moves in front of the star. And unfortunately, we think that's only true for about 1% of the stars that we look at, if things are randomly distributed. So the Kepler Space Telescope solved this in a very simple way. We looked at a large field of view. So these squares that you see are the actual cameras that Kepler had on board, looking at a piece of the Milky Way in the constellation Cygnus. And essentially, you don't have to count everything, but there's about 155,000 stars in this field of view. And so Kepler continuously monitored these 155,000 stars. So remember that we can only detect about 1% of the planets with this technique. So if these 150,000 stars would all have one planet, we would expect to detect about 1,500 planets. If only 1 in 100 stars would have planets, we would expect to detect maybe 15 in this field of view. And actually, what we found is a lot more. We found more than 4,700 planet candidates. That means that we found stars whose brightness went down in that way, but we need to confirm that with other means. In any event, we found so many planet candidates that we can actually now start pigeonholing them. And so to go back to this whole question, like how many stars could have liquid water on their surface? Well, it turns out that 1 out of 5 sun-like stars, they have a planet like the Earth, a small rocky planet in that habitable zone. So in our Milky Way galaxy alone, that means there's about 40 billion planets like the Earth. Okay, and so there's 300 billion stars in our Milky Way galaxy. There are way more planets than stars in our Milky Way galaxy. So planets, that's great. Lots of planets. We know that all these complex chemicals are widespread and abundant everywhere. So there's planets with water, there's all these complex chemicals. So how likely would it be then really that the Earth is the only planet with life? And so the last few minutes here, I want to now go over the question like, what about intelligent life, right? So we can find, in principle, we can get some estimate about intelligent life with this famous equation. It's called the Drake equation. And it's actually not a physics equation of any kind. It's essentially an ignorance equation. It's a way to kind of organize our ignorance about the entire processes. And so N essentially is the number of civilizations that we could communicate with right now. And it's essentially this product of factors. It's the number of stars that form per year, the fraction of stars that have planets, the number of planets per star, the fraction of planets where life developed, the fraction of life-bearing planets where intelligent life develops, the fraction of intelligent civilizations that develop communication, and then L is the length of time in which the civilization emits detectable signals. So if you want to know how many civilizations like that there are in our Milky Way galaxy, all you have to do is plug in the numbers, but of course, that is where the problem is. The first few of these numbers we know now, thanks to our work with the Kepler Space Telescope, we know that the product of the first 3 terms is about 10. We don't know the fraction where life develops. If we're going to say that this whole process of life is chemistry leading to biology, then well, let's say it's about half. But all the other factors, I mean, we really have no idea. And so the good thing is you can plug in your own favorite numbers and you can get any number that you want out there. And so the prospects are, well, either we're alone if you're a bit more going for these pessimistic numbers, or if you're going for these very optimistic numbers, then the entire galaxy is teeming with life. The only way that we're going to find intelligent life is if we actually go searching for them. And so I'm also a research associate at the SETI Institute. So SETI is a search for extraterrestrial intelligence in Mountain View, California. And so essentially, we are best known, I think, for our search using radio wavelengths. The reason why we use radio telescopes is that radio waves are much less subject to scattering. And moreover, there is this frequency range right here, right next to a spectral line of hydrogen and a spectral line of OH. Together, those make water, and so this is known as the water hole. It's also a frequency range where the galactic background is not too strong, so it's a great frequency to actually search for signals. It would be great frequency for us to broadcast our existence as well, if we would want to do it. So we are searching with a variety of telescopes. Here's the Allen Telescope Array in California that we're using. This is running 24/7. And so to give you an idea, we have already followed more than 200 million signals that on first sight looked promising or weird, but none of those really turned out to be deliberate signals. But in any rate, at this sort of speeds that we are currently searching for life, we will have searched around 1 million stars for SETI in the next few decades. And so at the current rate, we should have found life or a signal of life within the next 30 years, say. And if that's not the case, then we know that the last 3 factors in the Drake equation are small and smaller than 1 in a million. And then we'll get close to actually getting a reasonable estimate for what that number could be. And so I think to kind of summarize, I think the building blocks for life may originate from space, and those building blocks are widespread in the universe. And in about 3 decades, we should have a fairly quantitative answer to that question: how frequently technologically advanced civilizations develops. So the short answer to the question, are we alone, is, well, probably not, but we're not quite sure yet. Thank you. That's all I wanted to share with you.
Thank you, Jan, for a very fascinating talk. If there's questions, you can type them into the Q&A box. shy. Yeah, and this is more of a earth sciences question than a sort of astrophysics question, but how much how much evidence do we have of life from 3.5 billion years ago? You talked about those stromatolites in Australia, but I imagine a lot of the Earth from then has been either deeply covered over or eroded away or whatnot.
Yeah, so there's various kinds of fossils that we have from that age, and there's more debated evidence for life earlier on. So there's one particular set of crystals, there are zircon crystals where we can date them back to more than 4 billion years ago. And they have carbonaceous inclusions and isotopic ratios there suggest that they're also biological in origin. And if that's the case, that would predate what's known as the heavy bombardment, the late heavy bombardment, where essentially oceans boiled over from the energy of impacts. So that's more questionable, but if that actually would be confirmed that that's has an origin of life, then that's another argument that life actually has like a chemical process in the formation.
Perfect, thank you. And we have another question from Susie Martins. Do you think there's life on Mars?
Well, that's a good question. I think that the conditions on Mars were very similar to the Earth up to about 2 billion years ago when Mars lost its magnetic field. So we know that Mars had oceans of about 1.5 kilometers deep. We know that Mars has volcanoes. So essentially Mars had everything that the Earth had. So again, if the origins of life are using extraterrestrial chemicals to develop life, then life should have developed on Mars as well. But that would be primitive life. And of course, whatever happened after Mars lost its magnetic field, if there is life that managed to adapt to these changing conditions, then it may have retreated into these underground lakes. So I think Mars is a good candidate to at least find fossils of life or to find evidence for past life. There is some discussion that there may be actually current life because there's been claims that there's methane clouds, seasonally changing methane clouds on Mars, which could be created by microbes. And so that's another piece of evidence. It's not clear-cut evidence, but I think the chances are great. There's other places in the solar system too. Europa, moon of Jupiter, has a planet-wide ocean covered under an ice crust. That's also pretty good spot where you have all the ingredients again, and you have a heat source. So I think that's a great other place to search for life. It's more likely that we'll find evidence for life or you know the chemical processes leading to life in our solar system than from extrasolar planets. But it'll take a while.
Perfect, thank you. And we'll have one more question here before we move to Catherine's presentation. And the question is, what sort of educational background should people be getting if they want to help support these searches for life in the solar system or the galaxy?
Oh, that's an excellent question, actually. So this whole field is very interdisciplinary in nature. So the astro part kind of suggests you kind of need to know a little bit about the astronomy part. It's really astrophysics. The reason for that is that the conditions in space are very, very different than the conditions you have on Earth. And so that means that also physical and chemical processes are actually very different. There's things that can happen in space that cannot happen on Earth because you have these very long time scales before particles can collide. But you need to understand chemistry, you need to understand a little bit about biology, if possible, some geology as well. So really being a good all-rounder is ideal. I think a background in chemistry, biology, and astrophysics, that's kind of the sort of combination which is ideal. But people come in from all angles. People come in from chemistry and then learn the biology and the astrophysics that they need, or they come in from astrophysics and learn the biology and the chemistry that they need.
And maybe one final question. How did Mars come to lose its magnetic field?
Oh, that's an excellent question too. So Mars is small, and so it lost its heat. That's the key thing. If you take a pea and a potato out of the oven, then the potato will actually cool down slowly, but the pea will actually cool down very quickly. So Mars used to have a molten iron core, but as it cooled down, that solidified, and a solid iron core produces a much weaker magnetic field than a molten iron core. So that's decreased the strength of the magnetic field by roughly a factor of 1,000. And that caused the atmosphere to be pelted away by the solar winds, and that's what essentially also made Mars the red planet.
Perfect. Thank you again, Jan, for a lovely talk and some great discussion.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.